Are you aware of the butterfly effect? The theory that one small event, such as accidentally killing a butterfly, can drastically change the course of history? Because in the case of Grand Trunk Western 5629, it was a series of unfortunate events that ended up causing its tragic demise. The biggest culprit, however, wasn't a derailment or being replaced by diesel power, but possibly someone moving a fridge. Built in 1924, number 5629 was one of the 5 K4A class locomotives built by the American Locomotive Company to pull passenger services and fast freight on the Grand Trunk Western Railroad. It had a relatively uneventful service life, ending its career by pulling a special excursion train for rail enthusiasts in 1959, before being sold for scrap along with the rest of the K4As. It was rescued from the cutter's torch in 1960 by Richard Jensen, a long-time train enthusiast who'd saved his money with the goal of buying an engine of his own. Over the next year, Jensen and several volunteers spent their spare time getting 5629 back into working order. By 1962, it was in service again, pulling special excursion trains for rail fans, with Jensen acquiring a larger tender for it in 1966 to allow it to run long-distance trips. In September of the same year, Jensen also acquired engines 5632 and 4963 from the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy Railroad, with plans to run additional day trips with the engines. Both were stored at an old roundhouse belonging to the Chicago and West Indiana Railroad, as Jensen had become close friends with the railroad's president and was able to negotiate a deal. In 1968, however, the C&WI's president stepped down, and in 1969, new management wanted to demolish the roundhouse, giving Jensen only a few months to move his engines and the boxcars full of tools and spare parts. The engines and boxcars were moved to another yard, with the C&WI denying Jensen permission to inspect the rolling stock. By September, the C&WI illegally sold the engines and equipment to a scrap dealer. Jensen tried his best to get the engines back, even willing to pay the scrap value of them, but was declined. 5632 derailed while being shunted at the scrapyard in 1972, and so was cut up there and then. 4963 meanwhile was put into storage while the scrapyard figured out what to do with it. Jensen immediately filed a lawsuit against the C&WI for effectively selling his property without consent. Luckily, 5629 had been out on a tour when the ordeal happened, meaning it had avoided the fate of its fellow engines. Things, however, still weren't looking good. The loss of his engines and subsequent legal battle was putting Jensen in financial debt. On top of this, more and more railroads were unable to provide insurance or passenger cars for 5629's excursions, despite them often being sold out, and so by the end of 1969, Jensen was unable to run any more trips. An excursion from Chicago to Logansport was planned in 1971, but Penn Central backed out of providing the passenger cars. Cars were instead provided by the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad and the Milwaukee Road. However, arguments over insurance led to Jensen rescheduling the trip. After further conflict from Penn Central and Amtrak, the trip was cancelled, and Jensen got little of his money back. Customers that bought tickets were offered a free ride on another excursion or a refund, but some passengers felt cheated enough to file a lawsuit against Jensen, further adding to his financial troubles. Supposedly, he'd give $20 to anyone who approached him in person and said they'd paid for a ticket. For the next few years, Jensen kept 5629 in storage while organizing his finances and fighting several legal battles, mainly the Chicago and West Indiana Railroad for scrapping his engines. Then, in 1977, something happened that doomed 5629. Jensen was helping a friend move a fridge up to a third-floor apartment when he fell down the stairs, critically injuring himself and severely damaging his back. The medical bills, combined with his building legal fees, meant that he was unable to pay the storage costs for 5629, and so he began desperately searching for anywhere that would let him store his engine and equipment on their property. He eventually made a deal with the Rock Island Railroad, and 5629 was moved into a rotting old roundhouse at the Blue Island Freight Yard in Illinois. In the meantime, in 1979, Jensen had managed to squeeze a settlement of $707,000 from the Chicago and West Indiana Railroad, with an additional $1 million in punitive damages, though naturally the C&WI appealed the order. Even though he hadn't gotten a payment from the case yet, Jensen could see that damage done to his engines at the hand of the railroad was worth some serious money he desperately needed thanks to his hospital bills. In 1980, the Rock Island Railroad was liquidated and taken over by Metra Commuter Rail. Metra, wanting to demolish the old roundhouse, moved 5629 into the middle of the yard and left it there, ordering Jensen to move it. At this point, Jensen hadn't paid his rent since Metra's takeover of the yard, and so they weren't entirely in a cooperative mood. When Jensen went to inspect the engine, he found the rails in front and behind it had been pulled up, and that various parts were missing from the locomotive, taken by yard workers likely wanting a souvenir. With little to no money left to move it, Jensen realized that if he left 5629 where it was, Metra would be forced to scrap it. And because it was still legally his property, he could then sue Metra for destroying his engine and get a massive payout, similar to what had happened with 5632 and the C&WI. 5629 was missing several bearings and other critical parts, meaning it was unsafe to move anyway, so he felt he might as well go for the money. For the next 6 years, Jensen kept removing parts from the engine, making it harder and harder to move until 1986, when Metra got fed up of waiting and filed a lawsuit against Jensen. The court ruled that unless Jensen moved 5629, Metra would be allowed to dismantle it. Upon hearing this news, the Illinois Railway Museum, Mid-Continent Railway Museum, and multiple preservation groups approached Jensen with offers to buy the engine. Even Metra wanted 5629 to be preserved, themselves having donated 2 old interurban cars from the Chicago South Shore and South Bend Railroad to the South Elgin Trolley Museum. Jensen, however, declined every offer he was given. He wanted that massive payout. By June of 1987, Metra banned Jensen from entering their yard as they feared his constant removal of parts would make 5629 a safety hazard. Because it was on their land, Metra wanted to get rid of the engine, but because it wasn't their property, they couldn't legally take ownership of it. And so, on the 1st of July, a judge finally gave the order for Metra to scrap the engine. Jensen put in an appeal, but the court swiftly rejected it. Metra, with no other choice, contacted the Erman Howell division of the Luria Brothers Scrap Company, ironically the same company that had scrapped 5632 15 years prior. On the 14th of July, work began cutting up 5629. Crowds of people came to watch, and local police had to escort some spectators off the property. On the 20th, what was left of the engine was loaded onto a truck and taken away. Jensen filed a lawsuit against Metra, demanding compensation for cutting up his beloved engine, only for him to lose the case and further add to his legal fees. The gamble didn't pay off. All 3 of Jensen's locomotives were officially scrapped. He was swamped in both legal and medical debt, and the Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad's payout was still pending, leaving him broke and one of the most despised men by the entire American rail fan community. He passed away 4 years later in 1991, aged 59. There is, however, a silver lining to this story. Engine 4963 was still in one piece. Plans to cut up the engine were announced in the autumn of 1991, but the Illinois Railway Museum quickly stepped in, exchanging it for 5 Northwestern steel and wire 080 shunting engines. 4963 was moved to the museum, cosmetically restored, and put on static display, remaining there to this day. The story of Richard Jensen and his engines has since become infamous in the railfan community. While many think of him as a selfish old man who only wanted the money, in reality it was his medical bills that pushed him to gamble 5629 for a payout. Was he right to do it? That's for you to decide. But it does make me wonder, if he hadn't moved that fridge, if he hadn't fallen down those stairs and gotten stuck in medical debt, would 5629 still have ended up scrapped? I suppose we'll never know. Just remember to be careful next time you're moving a fridge. Subscribe for more.